In Yu-Gi-Oh, there are generally two factors that determine a deck's longevity. That's the ban list and power creep. See, these two factors are integral to Konami's business model. They print strong cards which competitive players have to buy to maintain their success, and then they ban those powerful cards so players need to once again tap into their pockets every 3 to 6 months. However, every now and then you'll see a deck that slips past Konami's radar. These rogue strategies either dominate events because players aren't prepared for them, or because they check the meta in an interesting way. Now, this is a discussion all by itself, but I'll save that for another day. So instead, let me ease you into the topic by discussing 10 rogue strategies that your opponent probably has forgotten about. So let's get into it. I want to start off by talking about Dynamorphia. This is probably a deck you've seen in some form or another over the years, but has become something that you'll see less of at recent competitive events. Dynamorphia is one of the best stun strategies in the game that centers around locking your opponent out of field monster effects via its boss monster, Nocturn. What's more, as a trap heavy strategy, it has a ton of control tools to simplify game states. In my opinion, Dynamorphia has the potential to become the runic strategy of the current format. Most meta decks are not prepared for it, especially Ryziel, since they have stopped playing Baguska. However, the deck does have a few inherent weaknesses that you should probably prepare for. Firstly, talents can steal your Rexdom, essentially turning it off. So you'll need to play around this as best as possible so that your opponent does not do this. Also, Underworld Goddess is a card that people are playing to out Chaos Angel. Now you can get around this by using your control tools to keep 4 monsters off your opponent's field, or by getting to 2 Rexdoms as quickly as possible. However, it is still a threat. Lastly, this deck kinda loses in time. So to win with it, you'll need to play both fast and urge your opponent to do the same. Don't be afraid to call the judge if needed. A lot of you may remember Raid Raptor. Last year when the deck got its new support, they were positioned as a budget deck that could check the, at the time, $1,000 Snake Eye strategy which was dominating the meta. This is because there are very few decks in the game that can deal with multiple towers that Raid Raptor excels at setting up. This is basically the deck's whole identity, and it's pretty good at accomplishing this, thanks to the deck being all gas. Basically, if Raid Raptors can get to a Rising Rebellion Falcon, then they win. This is a feat that hasn't changed in a year, despite power creep. But this deck unfortunately does have something that I'd call a crippling weakness that kind of holds it back slightly. See, while your main deck plays through hand traps very well, your extra deck does not. Specifically, all combo lines generally go through Raider's Knight, and it's pretty tough if your opponent negates it. Thankfully, you can play around Vela and Imperm via Raider's Wing, but Ghost Ogre does cook you. This doesn't mean you can't have success with the strategy. In fact, most modern players are unfamiliar with Raptors, and will probably have a hard time hand trapping correctly. If you can capitalize on this, expect to win regional events which conclude in a day. I wouldn't take this to a YCS or any event that runs 2 days, because players do talk, and if someone just spreads the word that Raider's Knight is a choke point, it does become a bit harder to actually reach those top tables. Marincess is a water Cypress deck that excels thanks to all of its monsters essentially being one card starters that either get you to an Aqua Argonaut or a Great Bubble Reef, depending on the card you open. Because of this, Marincess gets to play a ton of hand traps, which when played correctly allows the deck to thrive in most formats. This is why you'll occasionally see it topping. What's more is that the deck has just got a new support in Maze, via the extender which it always needed. Like Raid Raptor, it is a tower strategy that can end on a few negates plus an unkillable monster. Very few decks can deal with this, especially when Malice seems to be the only meta deck running Access Code Talker these days. What's more, the deck has a viable go in second strategy thanks to Zelantless, making it one of the few decks on this list that can either go first or second. However, this deck is very skill intensive. I can imagine a lot of you are pulling your faces right now. I don't mean that in terms of the combos, because those are pretty easy, but rather to have success with this deck you need to know where exactly to hand trap and how to do a lot with very few interruptions. In short, this deck feels a lot like Melodious, but what sets it apart is its ability to play either first or second, and that it gets to play powerful hand traps like Nibiru and Bastiles. Like Marincess, Speedroid has gotten new support, but it got a lot of it. 9 to be exact. But it's still the same machine synchro deck that we know and love. It has adaptive and complex combo lines that allow the deck to play through non-turn ending hand traps and can set up negates with a boss monster that is pretty hard to out. It feels both similar and different to Crystron. It has the advantage obviously that it doesn't lose to Lancia. But now, because this deck is as rogue as it gets, your opponent will basically not know anything about this deck or what it does, meaning that you can really take advantage of their ignorance to steal games. It has yet to make a name for itself in the competitive scene, but who knows, maybe you just might. Gladiator Beast is another deck that just recently got a new support and it actually made top 4 at a recent regional. This deck is a lot like Ritual Beast in that it specializes in contact fusioning. What's more is that this deck uses its battle phase a lot like Senpai. Basically, it attacks to cheat out more monsters. It's an interesting deck that feels like it has a lot of potential, especially to fill the Ritual Beast shape hole that people have in their hearts. Why, you may ask? Well, for 2 reasons. Firstly, it gets to play Tri-Brigades, which are both starters, and a decent plan B strategy for the deck. And because the deck doesn't lose to Lancia, which people are already playing to check Malice and Crystron. If you're an ex-Ritual Beast player, maybe you should consider hopping over to Gladiator Beast and see what success you can have with it. Drytron is one of the most loved archetypes in the game. I mean, just look at Logan JYA's channel. The man has dedicated himself to this deck and his following shows just how much people want to see it succeed. In January, I took this deck to a regional and actually finished 14 with it, which kind of speaks to its potential. The deck can't play a lot of hand traps, but it can play through them pretty well. What's more is that it has a viable going second strategy in Zeus. Going first, it ends on several negates, which are both negates and destruction effects, which make the strong meta contender. Essentially, imagine Appaloosa, but if Appaloosa also destroyed the target. That's basically what this deck does. However, it does have a weakness to Droll and Lockbird as well as to Bestials, which are people are already playing to check Fiendsmith, so it does feel unfortunate that you become a casualty of that as well. Now, a lot of people online make this seem to be though this is a big and huge problem for this deck, and on paper it is. But in fact, I've actually posted several videos of me playing this deck and showcasing that it can play around these checks pretty well. I'll leave a link in the description so you can check that out for yourself. Yugioh Sword Soul has got to be the wild card deck off this list. It's a lot like Speedroid in that it has yet to make a name for itself in the competitive scene. It's another negate based mid-range strategy like a lot of the decks on this list, so I will feel a bit too similar if I have to talk about this deck in detail. It's basically a lot like the decks I've spoken about to this far. What sets it apart is that the Yugioh strategy allows this deck to set up a one-sided dimensional fissure, which feels like an auto win against so many strategies. Most people are unaware that Mitsu, the ritual monster, and the field spell are choke points for the Yugioh strategy. So you can expect to steal a lot of games with this deck, especially against ignorant opponents. Ice Barrier is a deck that I both love and hate. It's a very good mid-range deck that has topped a recent regional, and it's a combo deck that feels both like a combo deck as well as a stun-based strategy. It also feels like a budget version of Ryziel Mitsurugi in this regard. I'm talking about the boss monster Lancia, which then special summons out a boy from your deck, and then the way it works is that while you control an Ice Barrier plus this other guy, your opponent has to discard a card every time they want to activate a monster effect. This is a lot like the Mitsurugi's boss monster. And because of this deck can have a success against a lot of strategies. I mean, if Ryziel Mitsurugi can do it, surely you can too. The drawback though is that most of your on-field effects, especially your starters, are ignition effects. So the deck does feel a bit vulnerable to both hand traps and pieces of removal. If you can work around this, you can pressure your opponents in very interesting ways. Like Marincess, Dragon Link has survived thanks to its ability to play a ton of non-engine and through its abundance of one-card starters. I've already spoken about Marincess in detail, and I would just be repeating myself if I went into detail about this deck too. What it does differently is that it can play supplementary engines a lot easier. Two of the most common would be the adventure engine, which just allows you to get up an Omni Negate pretty easily without sacrificing on any of your extra deck space, which is pretty tight in this deck. And it can also play Bestials to check Chaos format. On screen you'll see that I've shown the adventure engine, probably because at the time of recording this I am a bit uncertain as to what will happen with Bestials in the ban list. Either, the Bestials will get reprinted in Stampede and they will not be touched by the ban list, or they won't get reprinted and we'll see them getting limited. It's, a discussion in itself again, but for safety's sake I've put adventure here so that people who are looking at this in the new format can also just maybe have an idea of what they can play in that build. Also, what's pretty cool about this deck is that they're all dragons, and dragons are one of the most supported types in the game, meaning that this deck is always set to receive new support in some form or another. Essentially, it feels like an ever-adapting strategy, which makes it a decent investment. It sure as hell was a great investment when it released and people bought it, because this deck has survived for like 5-6 years now, and it doesn't look like it's going to slow down anytime soon, especially not at the regional level. Evil Eye is probably the rogue deck with the most metal-like qualities. It feels a lot like pure Ryzeal in that it can play like 20 plus non-engine, and it controls the flow of the game through its removal tools. It essentially forces decks into a grind game. What separates it from Ryzeal is its ability to play good pot cards like Prosperity and Extravagance to access resources a bit easier and more reliably than something like Pot of Desires. But what separates it from Ryzeal is that it can end on towers, which are difficult for many decks to out. I've spoken about this already if you think back to Raid Raptors and Marincess. It's very difficult for your opponent to out these decks, and it's also a very rogue deck, so a lot of your opponents won't really know what your cards do, making it very difficult for them to interact with you. The biggest drawback to the strategy is that it burns itself, which makes it a liability going into time. It's the same as Dynamorph here, and that's a bit of a problem for it.